Hello, and welcome to our first module of ACE 435. This module is going to deal with population, income, and consumption. All of the modules in this class are going to have three things associated with them. The first is a PDF file, and I would suggest you download that PDF file because it would be good for taking notes on. The second thing is a readings associated with that module. And again, we're going to list those readings, and those readings do match or go along with those modules. And finally, there is a review question at the end of each of these modules. We will discuss those review modules or those review questions in our class, and we will also use those questions, or those questions will be what is used to come up with our midterm and final exam questions. Our reading this week is World Agriculture Towards 2030 and 2050. I would like you to read pages 1 through 10 of that, so just the first 10 pages of that report. Those 10 pages deal with population, income, and consumption. This is from our Foreign Ag Organization, which is an agency of the United Nations. This reading takes the focus of feeding underprivileged parts of the world, so that is what the focus is going to be, but it also gives us a great feel for where the growth is going to be or could be in agricultural demand in the future, and what are the forces that are going to cause that growth. We are going to cover three topics in this module. The first is historical concerns about population and income. Second, indicators or factors that impact food consumption, and those are population and income. And then finally, differences between developed and undeveloped countries. There is a long history of being concerned about feeding the world. You will see that in the first paragraph of your reading, first paragraph on page 1. There they talk about Tertullian, going on to Malthus, and finally to Paul Ehrlich's population bomb, and we will come back to those topics later in the quarter, our semester. But what I want to do here for the next while is focus on Malthus. And Malthus is a famous individual, economist, who made the argument that we would face grave problems with food consumption in the future. That food would not grow enough to keep up with population growth. This was made in a population essay back in the late 1700s, and I'm just going to discuss a bit about what sort of assumptions he made when he made that prediction. Malthus believed, and this is true up to this point, that population was growing exponentially. You see that depicted on the red line here, exponential. Population is growing at an ever-increasing faster rate here. The axis of the graph that red line is on is population on the horizontal axis and food demand on the vertical axis. So we're drawing here with the red line, food demand, which would equal something like population times calories per person. So as the the population of the world grew, we would see an ever-increasing food demand. Malthus believed that food supply would not grow exponentially. So food supply, in this case, he believed would grow linearly. So food supply, while initially was above that of population needs, would eventually reach the point where population and food demand would outstrip the ability to supply that food. At some point, food demand would be above food supply, and that would be bad. That would lead to famine, social disruption, wars, and general breakdown of society, at which point population would fall and again meet the food supply. Malthus, as you can see, was not a utopian. Malthus suggested that there would be a number of things that kept population under control. Positive, or things that would happen naturally, are hunger, disease, and war. And then there was preventative things that a society could take or take control of, or support, or encourage, and that would include abortion, birth control, postponement of marriage, and celibacy. He also was not in favor of importation of grain, believing that a country should live on its own resources. And he did not also support public welfare because he believed it fostered more poor, which would then lead to more population growth. Ricardo was one of the first critics or non-believers in Malthus, or he was one of the first that wrote about it. And he believed that food supply would keep up, mainly because of increases in rents and bringing on land into agricultural production. Obviously, empirically, we have not seen anything like Malthus would suggest, but neo-Malthusians, who still exist today, argue that it will sometime in the future. Here is the debate, which we will continue to see. It has not happened yet, but it will, and it will not happen. That's the growth, or the Ricardian side. Just you wait. It will is the neo-Malthusian side. This is, again, a continuing debate, and you will see it in a number of readings that we will go through in this semester. We will, on one side, run out of resources, and no technology will keep up, and we will be able to feed our growing population. I want to turn to our next topic, Determinants of Consumption, and we begin with that with population. Here are some statistics from 2016 that shows population by continent: Asia, Africa, Europe, North America, South America, and Australia. And in 2016 there were 7.4 billion people in this world. 7,432 million, or 7.4 billion people in this world. I want you to note one thing here, where the people are and where they aren't. Asia and Africa. Asia, 4.4 billion. Africa, 1.2 billion. So, people are on Asia and Africa. To give you a feel for that, Europe, 739 million. And then you see North America below that. Here are some more population statistics, but this time we're going to do it by country. You will see that the USA, 325 million people, is the third country on the list. But I want to point one other thing out here. I have just put arrows next to the countries that are in Asia. And you can see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of those countries. And again, you would have got that same general idea from the populations of the continent, but this is our Pacific Rim. And you might have heard that term before, and that is where we expect growth to be in the future for agricultural demand for food. I am again going to take those numbers that we have just looked at and put them on this map, or put some of those and highlight some of those on this map. The darker spots here show higher population density, so the darker the spot here, the more population that you will see in that area. I have highlighted two areas, the USA with 325 million people. You can see that there. Look at Lake Michigan and you can see Chicago pointed out with its high densities, and then the densities close to the Atlantic coast and the Pacific coast with fewer people in the middle, and in particular in the west. 325 million people here. And then where also is another circle over Europe. Here we have a population of 739 million people. You can see the densities there. Bit more than the U.S., particularly when you get away from the coast. But these two areas are high income areas. They have some of the same characteristics as far as food demand, but developed areas, high income levels relative to other areas in the world, and we would not expect to see growth here as for food demand due to income increases, and that is a subject that we're going to talk about here soon. I've added another circle here to China. 1.4 million people, or excuse me, 1.4 billion people. Note that 1.4 billion people in China is greater than the 1 billion people in both USA and Europe. We have a large population center here. Note that it is also very high population density, particularly as you get close to the Pacific Ocean. So we have another a larger group of people. This is less developed, less income, and also one of the areas where we expect to see continued growth in food demand in the future. I have now added two more squares. India, or the Indian continent, 1.3 billion people. That 1.3 billion people is just for India. I haven't added Bangladesh or Pakistan in there yet. And also another circle for Indonesia with 261 million people. These areas, again, are areas where we would hope to see food growth in the future. All right, I've added one more circle to the area, and that is to Central Africa. As you can see, it is populated. I have put the population of Nigeria here, 186 million people, but overall, another large area with people in Central Africa. Now, population will obviously should cause a higher demand for food. So will income and GDP, or those are used interchangeably here, income or GDP. Wealth in a country, as we get more wealthy, we tend to consume more calories. Here you see some of that impact. Here the blue bars in this figure 1.1 comes from a reading, shows calories consumed per capita in the world, developing countries. One item to note is that developing countries consume less than developed countries, and overall we are expecting growth in pretty much every area of calories consumption to 2050 in the future. I am now going to try and illustrate the relationship between GDP and calories consumed or food consumed. I'm going to start here with listing GDP by different countries. We get this data from the World Bank. You see the list there and the screen, or the web address. You want to go there? You can go there and see GDP per capita. I'm going to use these to spotlight a couple of countries. I have picked several of those countries out and pasted those on this slide, and let me just go through some of the information on this slide. Let's start with the United States. Here we see that per capita GDP in 1960 was $3,007. It increased to $56,115 in 2015. You can see there a graph next to it, GDP growth over time, and overall growth, GDP per capita, has grown in the United States. Here we see the European Union and two countries within the European Union, Germany and Norway. $32,004 of GDP in 2015 for the European Union. Germany had $41,000 and Norway had $74,000. You can see that there are differences in the European Union. Germany is sort of middle of the road. A lot of the differences have to do with East and West, communist versus non-communist. Remember that Germany was split between East and West Germany, and East Germany fell behind during the communist era. You will note that both of these countries have had growth in GDP, as you would expect, as well as the European Union. Now we add China, and note $89 in 1960. It has had phenomenal growth. Look at that curve, particularly later on. Growth in GDP, red curve. China is now at $8,000 of GDP. Note that it has grown, but it is still far behind United States and European Union. I have now added India, Indonesia, and Nigeria. Note that those countries are growing, but how much further lower their GDP is than United States and even China. Now this graph shows real GDP per person on the horizontal axis and total cereal consumption on the vertical axis. I'm going to go through this graph, but you can think about putting each one of the previous countries on this graph. United States with income over 50,000 would be over on the right hand side of the graph. China, India, Indonesia, Nigeria would be closer to the left hand side of the graph. Let's take a closer look at the vertical axis. This is tons of cereal equivalent per capita per year. What this does is translates all consumption into cereal equivalent. Rice, wheat have a cereal equivalent, but so does livestock. And the livestock cereal equivalent is based on what you feed it. For example, hogs and poultry eat energy and protein that is translated into a cereal equivalent. Bovine eat forages, energy, and protein. Again, that is calculated and put into a cereal equivalent. One of the reasons why we do this, or why they do this, is to put livestock on an equivalent basis to that of cereals. If you eat a cereal grain, or let's say you eat Cheerios in the morning, you're eating cereal equivalents. All right? You did not pass that through the animal. On the other hand, if you have bacon in the morning, you're eating livestock, and that has a cereal equivalent. The cereal equivalent comes from what is fed to the livestock, and it will be more than the equivalent calories. So let's say your cereal has 100 calories, and your bacon has 100 calories. The cereal equivalents will be higher for the bacon because we fed more cereals to the hog. So this graph, by translating livestock into cereal equivalents, attempts to handle that fact that when we eat livestock, we are eating more cereal equivalents. Now let's take a look at the horizontal axis. This is real GDP per person. It's a measure of income in the country. It isn't perfect, but it is a measure of income in the country. Again, what we see is developed countries, U.S. and Europe, having higher income levels, and less developed countries having lower GDP levels or income levels. All right. Look at the graph, look at the red line, total consumption, and note that it goes up as GDP increases. Calorie consumption, or per tons of calorie equivalent, go up as GDP increases. Note, however, what's increasing. First, very bottom, crops, cereals, vegetables, and fruit do not increase much as we increase GDP levels, but pig meat, milk, and in particular bovine, mutton, and goat meat do. So as we see people get wealthy, we see calorie consumption increase, but the reason why it is increasing is because we're seeing people add meat or protein to the diet. In this case, we're seeing more pig, hog, pork consumption, milk consumption, and beef or lamb consumption. Again, the reason why wealthier people consume more calories is not necessarily because they're eating more calories per day, although they do. It's more because they are eating more livestock-related foods. Livestock have to eat cereals and proteins to grow, and when we account for those in their livestock diet, our calorie consumption increases over time. Here is a completed graph. It is from an earlier period. This is from 2002. But again, just look at where the countries are. Less developed tend to be on the left, more developed on the right. Calorie consumption, cereal consumption increases as we see GDP increases. All right, here's figure 1.4 from our readings. You can see that they are projecting meat consumption to increase, sugar cane or beet consumption to increase, oilseeds to increase, and cereals to increase. Those numbers are from 2005 base period to 2015. Much of the reason why those items are increasing is because of population increases, although we're projecting those to slow down, but also because of income increases. So let's summarize a bit here. In developing countries with lower GDPs, we expect to see consumption increase because of both population growth and income or GDP growth. We would expect to see less calorie or cereal equivalent increases in developed countries. The curve flattens. In those areas, we would not expect to see large growth in raw materials, but we might see more growth or concern with quality of foods, and meeting this need might be a more important thing in, say, U.S. and Europe. On the other hand, if we are in China, India, Indonesia, Africa, more of an emphasis on switching to livestock-based foods may be seen in the future and will be what is potentially causing increase in food consumption. Let's summarize here. Demand for food, increases in demand for food or calories or cereal equivalents increase as we see population growth and as we see incomes grow. And we generally see a switch to more proteins and specifically livestock. Pacific Rim represents a potentially large market. Again, we saw the high populations there and hopes for continuing high income growth in the future. Here's our review question from this module. On the following graph, show the relative positions of U.S. and China. Put U.S. and China on there. Indicate what this graph would indicate about their cereal equivalents, and what would happen if GDP continues to grow in China. That's our review question, and this is the end of this first module.